So thank you very much for having me. And so, as the CISO for Maricopa County, I've presented at a variety of different events, talking about a variety of different topics. Some of you have heard me talk previously about the impact of social media and things of that sort. But one of the topics that's really kind of become close and dear to my heart and our information security programs is this concept of, as technology evolves, what we're finding, at least at Maricopa County, is that the challenges and the problems that we have are still the same. And so it just winds up being more of a variation on a theme. So you might be asking yourselves, we're all in the technology business, so why are you saying things are the same? Well, Alphonse Carr has said that, and so he looks more distinguished than I do, although he doesn't have the head mic. But this is what we call in the business clickbait. So this was intended to get you interested in the topic and immediately drive you to think, well, no, this can't be right. Technology is constantly changing everything, and that's true. But fundamentally, from an information security perspective, what I'm hoping to impart upon you today is that you leave with a slightly different perspective in that, yes, will technology make things easier? Will it make it more efficient? Sure. That's assuming you do it properly, and that's a different presentation all in itself. But at the end of the day, I hope you leave this lunch and meal, A, full, and B, with the perspective of, yes, technology can augment, can enhance our operations, but fundamentally at the end of the day, we still all need to do the basic things that have plagued organizations, regardless of sector, for decades. So now, of course, there will be exceptions to that. I'll highlight, at least from my perspective, what some of those are, and hopefully that resonates with you as well. And so, at least from a format perspective, the intention is we'll try to save some time at the end for questions. If you have a burning desire to ask a question right then and there, strike when the iron's hot, so to speak, by all means, feel free to interject. We'll just need to get a microphone in front of you so that way all the virtual attendees can hear what your question is. So, all right, so a little bit more introduction for myself. I know a lot of the people in the room. I've been in the Valley since 1980, frankly. But my current capacity is as CISO for Maricopa County. I've been in that role. It'll be 3 years in November. Prior to that, my entire professional career, with minor exceptions, has been in the public sector. So prior to Maricopa County, I was at City of Mesa for 9.5 years, where I was an IT manager and also their CISO. And so my mentor slash boss, the first CISO, actually, I think you were the first one with that title, right, Pat? So he's in the room. And so prior to that, I ran the IT organization for the town of Queen Creek, for those of you familiar with the area. So I was the first full-time IT hire at the town of Queen Creek. So I started that department from scratch. True story, I was there when they set up their first traffic light. So I was also there when they created the fire department as well. I helped set up everything. So, and then prior to that, I know there's a couple of ASU folks here. I started off my IT career at Arizona State University. So, anywho. Now, I also wanted to give you a little context about Maricopa County, because in this keynote, I'm going to be making reference to Maricopa County, some of the challenges we specifically have experienced, things that we've seen from a technology evolving perspective, as well as some of the challenges that we're seeing that have been consistent along those lines. So a little bit about Maricopa County for those of you not overly familiar with the organization. By population, we're the 4th largest county in the United States. In terms of population growth, we're the fastest growing county in the United States. We have, plus or minus, depending on what year it is and what reorg has occurred, we have 56 different departments in Maricopa County. 8 of them are elected as opposed to appointed, and so that's important. But we have multiple decentralized IT shops within the organization. We're just a little bit under 14,000 employees. For the vendors in the room, that translates to about 15,000 endpoints if you want to sell me something. But probably the most important distinction that's relevant for our conversation is that those 8 elected departments by ordinance pretty much have autonomy from the rest of the organization. They are not, quote unquote, overseen by the Board of Supervisors. There's a close, obvious working relationship between the elected officials. So, and what I mean by elected officials, like the county sheriff, the recorder, the treasurer, the county superintendent of schools, et cetera, with the Board of Supervisors. But from an IT governance and from an information security governance perspective, it poses quite the challenge, because at the end of the day, as an enterprise CISO for the organization, I can strongly recommend, but I don't have that stick. So, you know, the analogy of the carrot and stick, the only reason why you use the carrot is so you get the person close enough so you can hit them in the head with the stick, right? So, but by ordinance, I can't make these departments adopt our frameworks, our standards, our controls, et cetera. So I have to take a collaborative approach with respect to information security. And no surprise to anybody in this room, and again, I'm not passing judgment, I'm not trying to be political, but Maricopa County can't stay out of the news. We'll just leave it at that. So, all right, so the whole premise of this talk is the following, is there's no shortcuts to success. And this also pertains to information security, even with the advent and the constant change and evolution of technology, right? So to give you some perspective from my age and my tenure in the tech field, my first gig, I was basically doing, I was using VI editors, my text editor. I was writing HTML code by hand for non-graphical browsers, if that gives you any indication of how old I am in tech years. So now, with that being said, has web application development, for example, changed significantly? Of course, but the premise behind that is the same. And so, according to Coach Wooden here, you know, bottom line, there's no shortcuts from doing what's necessary and doing the basics, right? And so what we'll talk about over the course of this meal is what are some of those basics, some of the impacts that technology has had that actually has made it, at least from my perspective and Maricopa County's perspective, more difficult to do than, say, 5-10 years ago. So some of the examples we're going to talk about this afternoon are the following: IoT, virtual technology, AI, ML, and cloud technology. I mean, based off of this probably looks like a vendor's Mad Lib, right? So, but these are all things that are pertinent to all organizations, regardless of sector, and whether we are conscious of it or not, from a cybersecurity perspective, we are impacted by this. So let's take the first use case. And I know I've talked to a couple of you in the room in previous roles about IoT initiatives that I've been involved in, but obviously, and I don't need to explain to this group that IoT is everywhere. I think we don't appreciate from an enterprise perspective how pervasive and ubiquitous IoT technology is, right? So when I talk to my fellow, CISOs, or better yet, when I talk to my CIO, the conversations I have typically when it comes to IoT are like, okay, Ed, that's his name, by the way. So Ed, ask me how many IoT devices we have in our environment. And he's like, okay, Lester, how many do we have? And my response is, I have no idea. So, because, depending on how you define IoT, questions, ask yourself this question: your organizations, albeit, the work from home puts a little different spin on things, but how many TVs have your organizations bought? Guarantee if it's been any within the last 5 years, it got Wi-Fi enabled on it. Is it turned on by default, right? How many toasters have you bought? How many of you own the building that you're in, and so the building automation system that are contained therein are your responsibility? Or if you happen to be local government, in my case, we have a high number of IoT devices between public health, our transportation department. When I was at the city of Mesa, we had the SCADA network for all the utilities, et cetera, et cetera. IoT is prevalent. I guarantee I have yet, and if somebody in the room wants to prove me wrong, I would love that to happen. But I have yet to meet an organization or anybody who's willing to stick their neck out and say, I have a high degree of confidence, say 90+%, that I know all the IoT devices in my environment, let alone be able to say with a straight face that they have a plan that's been operationalized to manage said IoT infrastructure, right? IoT's been around for what, 20 plus years? So this is not a new problem that we have, right? The problem is with the proliferation of IoT technology, we still have yet in a lot of ways gotten our arms around that from a cybersecurity perspective. And part of the issue from my observation in talking to vendors in particular is a lot of IoT, when you say IoT, people automatically think of like Alexa devices or the wireless TVs and things that are IP based, right? But that's not always the case. You know, from a security perspective, I'm concerned about devices that operate primarily on Bluetooth, or if you're in remote communications, LoRa protocols, or things that are non-IP based, cellular, et cetera, et cetera. So it runs the gamut, right? So, again, because I want you guys to keep your meals down, I'm not going to ask these questions, but how many of you, just mentally, how many of you have security standards built specifically for IoT in your environments? How many of you patch your IoT devices? Wow. You just wanted to flex and say that you actually patch IoT devices. Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah. So for those of you who didn't hear, the gentleman's from ASU, and so that's a great example. ASU is probably an elevated example of the worst nightmare you could have about bring your own device, right? Is in essence what he's talking about and some of the challenges associated with those types of technologies and bringing them into the dorms, bringing them into your academic, your lab environments, your administrative environments. So I feel your pain. Haven't worked for ASU for 10 years. So, but really, by and large, I would dare say, and I'll be the first to admit publicly, that we don't have an active regimen in place on how we patch, or depending on how you define patch, right? Apply firmware updates to IoT devices to ensure that they're not susceptible to, I don't know, the last Log4j, the last Spectre, the last Meltdown, 0-day vulnerability that's come out, right? And so the case in point is IoT is not a new technology. It's constantly evolving. We're seeing new tech come out of that. Especially with voice assistants and things of that sort. But also this idea of, like, for example, leveraging this concept of digital twins and using certain technologies to emulate your entire subset of your network, right? And so the problems that we're facing as an information security team here in Maricopa County is IT asset management. We'll be the first to admit that, right? How do you do vulnerability scanning against IoT devices? Are you doing that? That makes the presumption that you know what you have in the first place in order to actually be able to effectively attempt to do vulnerability scanning, let alone patch management. One of the challenges with IoT devices is that there's not, to my knowledge, there's not an enterprise solution out there that will take multiple disparate IoT devices and give you a single mechanism by which you can reach out on a predetermined basis to ensure and check that you have the latest firmware, you're patching, et cetera, or making configuration changes to the IoT devices to support the standards that you hopefully have. Those standards might be, hey, a lot of these IoT devices allow for web interface for administration of said device, right? Does it enforce HTTPS, or is it still in HTTP, clear text, et cetera, and not to mention, and we don't have this kind of time, but data management. Think about all the data that your IoT devices are collecting, right? How do you ensure you have the appropriate permissions, not only from an access perspective to the device itself, but what about the data that's being generated as a result of those IoT devices? you might be doing some edge computing, right? So a very popular use case in local government is you may have web camera interfaces for, like, say, your traffic systems, and you're collecting video data, and you're doing that processing on the edge because you don't want to pipe all that data into your internal network and, have that level of consumption and bandwidth churn, et cetera, et cetera. So you're doing all that stuff on the edge. How do you ensure that you have the right data and access management in place along those lines? So again, these are common problems specific to IoT that have been around forever. And so these are considerations that we need to take as information security professionals. And we have a long way to go. We have a plan at Maricopa County on how we're going to tackle that. So second use case, AI, machine learning, right? So every new technology seems like that we're evaluating has some flavor of AI or machine learning in place. Now, with that being said, I'm not trying to deprecate the importance of this technology as it relates to us or just business in general, because at the end of the day, everything, including what we do from a cybersecurity perspective, is fundamentally based on data, right? So I'm a very big proponent of artificial intelligence and machine learning when properly implemented based off of business needs. But in many instances, human intervention is still needed in terms of these technologies. So in the case of AI or this artificial intelligence, what human interaction are you actually looking at replacing? So there is a distinction between AI and machine learning, right? So in a lot of cases, local government, for example, the AI experiences that they want to employ is in relation to inquiries by our constituents or our business community as to where to go about getting services, right? So using AI-based chatbots to answer basic questions that would normally take a real live person to answer, right? In the case of machine learning, especially supervised machine learning, how are you going to help the technology learn and improve the decision making? So that's the whole concept behind assisted machine learning, which is, hey, you're going to put some parameters in place with respect to the data sets, what the correlations are, et cetera, to help the technology churn and burn and identify what those relationships are between disparate data sources and to continue working on your data models. However, at the end of the day, from a cybersecurity perspective, regardless of the technology you're talking about, you need to understand what the data is that you're ingesting and you're using for AI and ML. If for no other reason, even if the technology works as advertised by the vendor community to say, hey, you don't need to understand the data, our technology will resolve that for you. That might be the case, maybe not. But from a security perspective, you need to know what data you're looking at, if for no other reason, data privacy, right? Now, I don't want to get too esoteric about data, but there are concepts in data analytics. One of them is differential privacy. Feel free to Google that if you want. But it hasn't really been made commercially viable to my knowledge. But at the end of the day, especially as local government, let's be honest, trust in government is at an all-time low. That's not my personal sentiment. There's been research done along those lines. So the last thing we want to do is give our residents and our constituents one more reason not to trust us. So from our perspective, from an information security perspective, we want to ensure that whatever technology is being leveraged, we understand the data behind it and what the nature of that data is and whether or not it needs to be protected. So additionally, another big problem with AI and machine learning, it also goes to, this also assumes you know what data you have in the first place. So much like our conversation about IoT, and do you truly know what IoT do you have in your environment? I would ask the same question from a data perspective, right? Everybody can say, oh yeah, we have Exchange, we have Microsoft SQL, we have Oracle, we have all these major enterprise applications. What about the other maybe non-enterprise applications that you have? Or what about your data repositories? And do you know where they're at? So part of the challenge is, and we'll talk a little bit more about this here in a second, but part of the challenge is our traditional local area network is no longer a traditional local area network. So between the advent of IoT technology, cloud technology, which we'll talk about in a sec, and frankly, I mean, I'm sure all of you have experienced on one occasion or another somebody from your finance department whose production Excel spreadsheet to manage the budget instead of going through their ERP system is on a thumb drive or an external drive that they carry around with them, right? I mean, those are all the things that we as information security people have to be concerned about. And so, and even if you scan the data, and let's say you have a high degree of confidence that you know where all the data is that is of interest to you, you still have to know what data that is. So from a data privacy and from a data protection perspective, you could put the right controls in place. So this concept of ACLs or access control lists or things of that sort has existed even before I started in IT. So this is not a new problem. The evolution of technology is such that it's made that existing problem that's been around forever and a day, it just exacerbates it and makes it that much more difficult to get our arms around. So case in point, once again, I would advocate as an information security / quasi data professional that data should be considered an asset. So if you have an ITAM in your organization, IT asset management solution, and you're not tracking either through that mechanism or say something that's dedicated to a data management overarching enterprise solution, that you should be tracking data sources and data sets as assets, no different than your hardware and your software. Data management as a whole, and then access management. So the same principle exists. So again, you know, is two sides to this. So regardless of what the technology is that you're leveraging from an AI machine learning perspective, whether that technology needs to understand the data that's being consumed is a separate problem than protecting it from an information security perspective, right? All right, the third one. This one's probably the biggest no-brainer, frankly. Everybody's embraced the cloud. So I'm going to dish a little dirty news on Maricopa County's journey from a cloud perspective. And so apologies to you, Bianca, just to lump you in with me. But it's been my observation that government has been a little bit slower than other sectors to adopt the cloud. She's nodding, so at least she's on my side publicly. So, but I will say COVID really changed the velocity or the take rate in how government all of a sudden became super open to adopting cloud, right? So in Maricopa County, we physically closed a lot of facilities. Not that we could fully close and be all remote, because obviously we had public health, which played a critical role in the response to the pandemic. Obviously our jails, our sheriff's office, et cetera, et cetera. But we impacted a lot more services than we realized in IT. So great example, local government's rife with locally grown and hosted applications. And then, so all of a sudden, we just had all these departments come out of the woodworks reaching out to us saying, hey, we need to make these local apps available on the internet and consumable. So two examples that come to mind. The county is responsible for birth and death certificates, kind of morbid or celebratory, depending on your perspective. Yeah, those were both internally hosted applications. But the only way to take advantage of that was to actually do a walk-up into one of our facilities with the appropriate department. So now all of a sudden, we had all these services that were either going to be rewritten, but the vast majority of those that they wanted to rewrite, they couldn't wait the development cycles to do that. So we had to expose those to the internet. So in that instance, we leveraged cloud-hosted WAF service to minimize the risk down to a level that was acceptable. It wasn't great because the applications weren't designed or factored for internet consumption. So I'm not trying to kid anybody in the room. So it wasn't the most elegant solution, but it was the only viable one to us based off of what our business needs were, right? Because we have 4.5 million residents that we have to support and tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of businesses that we have to help as well. And so that was the route we had. So our hesitancy to adopt the cloud virtually disappeared overnight. And so, and I will tell you, security was the last thing that these departments were thinking about. So almost nobody cared about that, with obvious exceptions. So now, from my perspective, cloud's been great. It's been a godsend, but the cloud has just made, frankly, everything more challenging from a security perspective. So all the problems that the information security program at Maricopa County has just became almost exceptionally more difficult. And so on top of that, we had self-inflicted about a year prior, no, about actually 6-8 months prior to the actual pandemic, we had brought Gardner in to do engagement with us on how we were going to move forward and what our cloud strategy as a county was going to be. And so my department decided that we wanted to become a cloud broker for the rest of the other external departments. So we wanted to be the organization by which, okay, if you're the sheriff's office, you're going to work with us. We're not going to tell you what to do. We're going to facilitate whether you want to get on AWS, Azure, whatever the case is, Google. I'm just looking at you because you're at the front table, sorry. So, but we wanted to facilitate that. We weren't trying to tell you how to do this, but rather be the vehicle by which you got onto the internet, right? If you wanted to export your backups to the cloud, we'd do so in a responsible fashion. So instead of being over our ISP links and then congesting the rest of the enterprise, which happened, we would give you an express route so that you could do so in a secure and efficient manner. And so on top of all the cloud challenges, we also self-inflicted that we wanted to be this cloud broker. So anyways, so everything, frankly, from a security program that we do and are still doing is in one shape or another being impacted by the accelerated adoption of cloud services. So IT asset management, software as a service, platform as a service for those organizations that are starting to do more with containerization or infrastructure as a service. Is that part of your ITAM? Do you know where those assets are? Additionally, are you scanning? So if you have VDI instances in Azure, for example, are you doing the vulnerability scans and are you doing the monthly Microsoft patches? Or worse off, do you have a bunch of Linux boxes out there running all sorts of flavors of Linux? And when's the last time that you've, RPM minus UVH? I'm showing my age. Nobody uses RPM anymore, but you get the idea, right? So patch management, data management, what data are you storing out there? For those of you who are doing actually doing something along the lines of data loss prevention, right? Maybe you're doing that at your firewall level. So what about those cloud services? Do you have the same DLP rules in place? Do you have the same DLP checks in place? Access management, privileged access management. How many of you have in your organization have cloud services that are not tied in via SSO to your Active Directory or whatever directory service that you have? And so then by extension, when you have transfers or onboarding folks, or more importantly, offboarding them, how do you ensure that those accounts are being deactivated? So account management's been a problem, again, since before I started IT, right? And so these are all things that and so going back to the premise of the talk, as more technology changes, the more things stay the same from a security perspective. It's more like a variation on a theme, for lack of a better description. I mean, yeah, it's technically different, but the core tenets, the core challenges that we're facing as cybersecurity professionals are staying the same. And in some instances, it's becoming more challenging. Last one, I'm not going to delve too much because virtual technology is so ingrained with the other stuff that we talked about, right? Like, let's be honest. Without the maturation of virtual technology or virtualization, we wouldn't be adopting cloud services to the degree we are, right? I mean, that's just a given. But really, the takeaway here from a virtual technology that I wanted to share with you is the same discipline and processes that existed for on-prem services and infrastructure, so heavy metal, your routers, your distribution switch infrastructure, et cetera, also apply to the virtual layer. So Maricopa County is going through a process, we're calling it our Next Gen Network project, where we're reevaluating our entire enterprise network infrastructure. That's a cue to you vendors that's forthcoming. So, but we're evaluating our enterprise network infrastructure, and that's obviously going to extend along those lines. So some of the things we're talking about is, hey, how are we going to provide infrastructure services, especially to the external departments that want to maintain a certain level of autonomy? So some of the things we're contemplating is allocation of virtual firewalls, right? That way they inherit our rule set, our configuration, our defaults, but then we give management control over that portion of the network to said department, et cetera, et cetera. Privileged access management takes on an entirely new role. Now, when you start mixing these technologies, how many of you are tracking creds for your IoT devices in your enterprise privileged access management solution? Chances are good, A, you're probably not tracking them. And so whenever you need to log in, you're probably Googling to see what the default user and password is, right, to log into the device. Or maybe you've taken it one step in your maturity and you have an Excel spreadsheet, right? So yeah, so you're laughing, but you're crying on the inside. So, so I don't want to end the conversation on a down note, right? Because all I've talked about is how screwed we are as information security professionals, right? So technology does have a role, and we are exploring, as much as all of you are, I'm sure, how we can leverage technology to address these problems that have plagued us for years, if not decades. So insight, visibility is probably one of the biggest things that we're seeing. And I'm not gonna drop vendor names. That'd be inappropriate. But we need to leverage technology. And in our case, we're trying to look at technology that is not agent-based in our instance to get our arms around visibility. So why? Because when I talk to my CIO, I can't legitimately tell him how many IoT devices there are in my environment. And we have so many decentralized services. I'm gonna rat out my last organization, not my current one. So Pat might be aware of this. We had a department at the city of Mesa, who will remain nameless, that went out and set up their own shopping cart. So they set up a website. They apparently started taking PayPal as a payment, which wasn't the enterprise standard, by the way. So that was a surprise to me. And and so they all of a sudden, through a third party, they got their own merchant ID. They weren't coordinating with our finance department in terms of merchant IDs. They were taking forms of payment that weren't city standard, and we just happened to stumble across that. And so you might think that's hilarious, but it is hilarious, but that could happen to any of us. Anybody with a credit card or a P card for an organization, unless you have some internal controls to look for goofy purchases, which I highly encourage, by the way, could really, at the end of the day, do that. And then all of a sudden, now you have a new cloud service, one that's financial to boot on top of that, that you may or may not be aware of. Now, given the propensity to work from home on top of that, let's say you have an advanced use of your firewall technology and you're going to be like, oh, well, somebody tries pulling that and they start connecting with PayPal, for example, for payment authorizations. We watch over firewall traffic. Well, great for you. What if it doesn't traverse the firewall? We're all working from home. Some organizations have gotten rid of that, right? So unless your technology addresses that, you might be losing visibility on what's going on and how those services are being stood up and being consumed. Data as an asset. I think this one's painfully obvious. We need technology to help us at least get a running start in terms of what data exists, what format is out there, et cetera, right? And then, of course, there's other appliances and other devices that we need insight on. And so this goes back to why, at least in Maricopa County's case, we're focusing on technology solutions that don't require an agent. Because at the end of the day, as a CISO, obviously I care about endpoints and workstations, But I also equally care about appliances that don't allow me to install an agent on that device, right? Because it's hardened. It's probably running some hardened version of Linux on it, right? And so if I can install an agent on it, doesn't mean I don't care about it. It doesn't mean I don't want to be aware of it. So that's why our focus, at least from an insight discovery perspective, is on agentless, or at least an option with an agentless kind of hybrid approach with regards to insight. So for those orgs that have an enterprise risk program, or maybe a more mature cyber risk program, how well do you do with managing these devices? So again, we've talked a lot about this, but I would also challenge everybody in the room that don't necessarily take Maricopa County's, by the way, going through its own ITSM implementation right now. And so I'm trying to negotiate with the exec in charge to broadly expand the definition of asset. So I want to include data, I want to include certificate management, I want to include homegrown apps, mobile devices, multifunction devices, everything that has a potential security concern or ramification to me. And I also want to know where the data is at and how it's being stored, so I can at least begin the process of ensuring we have the appropriate permissions in place. But so I know this is really overwhelming. So one thing that I would encourage everybody here in the room to consider, if you haven't started already tackling these kind of problems and leveraging technology to address it, is perfect is an enemy of good. But that's not to suggest that we shouldn't be honest with ourselves about how good our good really is. Chances are good, our good is really not that good. So integration is the key with regards to insight. And again, I'm not going to drop a vendor name or shill for anybody, but what we're looking at in terms of getting insight into our environment basically takes multiple existing disparate data sources as it relates to assets, aggregates them together to give me a single pane of, but I hate that term, so I'm not going to say it. But that's where technology can add value to help an age-old problem along those lines, right? But you just have to have the mental and the physical and emotional fortitude to want to begin that journey, right? But I'm of the strong belief, and I could be wrong, but I'm of the strong belief that technology will never, ever, at least in my lifetime, easily get to the point where it will solve those problems without you taking those initial painful steps. And then management. And so we touched upon this, especially in the context of IoT. And it not only applies to IoT, but also certainly to the cloud. If we can't assess risk, we can't assess risk from a security perspective if we don't know what we're on the hook for. And so management of these devices, management of cloud services, for example. So, and again, I'm not going to belabor this because we've talked quite a bit about this, but one thing I would encourage you to do is, again, part of the challenge with IoT is the management aspect, which is, I think all of us in the room probably have a good grasp on our Microsoft devices. We all probably follow some iteration of the monthly patch cycle, but we really don't do that from an IoT perspective. And I have seen personally, we're constantly at Maricopa County, we're constantly getting scans and attempts to our external web-facing assets for attacks that are based off of IoT technology. We just constantly see it, so it's nothing new. So, and again, from a management perspective, how are you going to manage those assets, right? One option is compensating or mitigating controls, right? So a compensating or mitigating control could be like, okay, I've detected these IoT devices. I've determined based off of some criteria, either MAC address or MAC family or some other unique identifier, that this device doesn't belong to my environment, right? So I'm going to use technology to take that device, dump it into a dedicated VLAN that only has access to the internet and can't traverse the internal network. So that might be a compensating or mitigating control. Is it perfect? No. But what's the likelihood that your organizations have enough staff, even some of you who work for multinational, multi-conglomerates, you probably don't have enough people to actually go run out and patch 200,000 IoT devices, right? Let's be honest. So mitigating or compensating controls. Triage is another option. So this goes back to the visibility conversation. So I can tell you, and again, just to air some dirty laundry from Maricopa County's perspective, when we got hit with Log4j, it took us about a week across the enterprise and across all the departments to identify all the susceptible devices with the Log4j attack. And I can tell you, and I'm not flexing because it's government, but we were probably faster on the uptake than some of the other government agencies. So that's kind of like saying you're the sharpest spoon in the drawer, though. So I get it. But, so we took a look at that assessment, and then we had to prioritize based off of other factors which ones we were going to tackle first and try to patch, right? So we did that through a variety of different criteria, where that sat in the network, if it had a direct or indirect impact on critical services, et cetera, and then we went through the triage process of saying, okay, this is what we're going to patch first, and this is how we're going to go about doing it, that sort of thing. And in some instances, you may need to amputate. So I did a Google search on amputate images, and none of them were appropriate for a lunch presentation. So I got you guys covered. So. And then, another option is quarantine. We are all familiar with quarantining on a personal level. And so just apply that same logic to technology, right? And so the example I gave with like the VLAN and dumping it into a dedicated VLAN that can't talk to the internal network is one option of quarantining. And, another option, it's not really technology related, but it maybe is a good one. Part of our standards at Maricopa County is, at least on paper, I'll be the first to admit, execution leaves something to be desired, but we do have standards in place that says, if you drop an IoT device in our internal network, you shall do the following. You shall ensure that if you're going to remotely connect to it for administrative purposes, it has to support HTTPS. You have to change the default password at a minimum, preferably the username if you can as well. But at a minimum, you're going to change it so that way somebody can't Google your device and then log in along those lines. So standards do have a role to play along those lines, not really technically driven, but just more good hygiene and process, if you will. So in summary, technology can almost make everything we do easier, right? We still have to hit the woodshed. At least that's what my undergrad's in music. So my instructor would tell me I'd have to hit the woodshed a little bit more because I never practice, which is why I'm not a musician. And we have to do these things: vulnerability scanning, patch management, asset management, data management. I mean, that one's particularly nebulous for a lot of organizations. There's no silver bullet along those lines. Those are things that just require a certain level of fortitude from an organization and will perspective. Technology can help ease the pain, but you still have to make that an effort, and you still have to tackle that. We have to do the things we don't like. I call it eating our vegetables first, right? So we have a lot of departments in our organization that have jumped on the AI and machine learning. And then when I ask them, hey, where are you at on deployment of CrowdStrike? Oh, sorry, I did drop a name. We're a CrowdStrike shop. Where are you at in the deployment of CrowdStrike? Oh, we've deployed it to, these number of devices. And I'm like, yeah, but they're all in monitor mode. They're not in block mode. Oh, we'll get to that. So you got to eat your vegetables first before you have dessert, right? And so at least from an information security perspective, that's what we try to preach. Focus on the processes needed first, and then the technology second. Because all technology is going to do is make a crappy process more efficient, right? So we've implemented SOAR technology in our shop, and so we depend on it more and more. But we take a very cautious approach about what it is that we automate along those lines, because the last thing we're going to do is implement automation that either makes a bad process more efficient, or in some instances, one of the things that we do with SOAR is with trusted threat intelligence that we receive, Upon receipt from trusted sources, within a span of 15 minutes, we automatically blacklist that on a temporary blacklist on our firewall. So the last thing I'm going to do is not review that process and make sure we vetted how we trust the threat intelligence that we received, because I've received IOCs in the past, so has Pat, I know for a fact, that have suggested that we blacklist Google's DNS IP address. I'd be out of a job, you know? So processes first, technology second, and just iterate. Don't wait until it's perfect. Just make incremental but forward-moving changes. Rinse and repeat, rinse and repeat. You know, once you get patch management good enough, maybe work on the next thing. You know, don't get patch management perfect. You have to constantly reassess where you're at, which I know is contrary to, like, for those of you who are application developers, right? You know, this concept of just-in-time working, you know, Kanban boards and things. The premise behind focusing on one task is so you're not churning and burning and shifting between multiple processes all the time, and then the ramp up time and the ramp down time in order to shift between tasks. Yeah, that works from an application development perspective, but when you factor from a global information security perspective, your CISOs, your IT directors should be constantly assessing the risk to the organization. And once you've improved processes and used technology to improve an aspect of your program to a certain level, then you need to reassess and say, okay, where's the greatest risk to my organization now? And that's what I'm going to focus on, right? So you need to constantly iterate. It may not be in the same place or in the same function of your program overall, but constant incremental improvements are way better than waiting 6 years to try to finally figure out how your vulnerability management program is going to encapsulate IoT devices and cloud services. So with that being said, hopefully you were able to take something out of this. I don't know if there's anybody with a mic ready to go for our audience members, but we either have a question or a critical comment. I have yet to determine that. So this gentleman back here.
Hi, Lester. Thank you for a great talk. You were mentioning some things don't change, so other things might change. I mean, one of the things that that we've seen lately is that our software vendors or appliance vendors, they have their own IT, and that can be compromised. So you get this chain effect. And for me, that's something that I haven't seen in the past so far. So I'm curious on your opinion on that.
Yeah, great. So that could have easily been another example along those lines, right? And so that's more akin to, from our perspective, vendor management, right? And so I've done presentations where not only do we have to worry about third-party vendor management, now what you've just described is what they are calling fourth-party, right? And so the example that comes to mind for those of you who were in IT back in 2016, there was a day, I want to say it's in October, where most of the internet stopped working. And so that was an attack against a company called Dyn. And Dyn basically was a DNS resolution company. And so they got hit with a massive DDoS attack from, oddly enough, a bunch of IoT devices. I want to say Chinese manufactured DVRs, if I'm not mistaken, and some ancillary IoT devices did a DDoS attack against Dyn. So why are we talking about that in the context of your question? Is because Dyn just happened to be the DNS provider to a bunch of companies like PayPal, Okta, a bunch of news outlets, and so all of a sudden, a good majority of the United States didn't have access to those services. So that was an example of fourth-party vendor management that, because they got whacked, they had a trickle effect down to their immediate customers and then the customers of their customers, if you will. And so from our perspective, yes, we're very concerned along those lines. So the way that Maricopa County is actively trying to tackle that is, and again, I hate to say it, but just to be honest with you, we need to do a better job of getting our arms around assets in the first place. Because if we don't know what those assets are, whether they're cloud services, internal apps, devices, et cetera, we can't then begin to have an effective vendor management solution. Now, with that being said, We are tackling it on a multiple front perspective. We're looking at technology to do that for us. We're looking at implementing GRC to help us manage what our vendor management program is going to look like along those lines. We're also updating, we just recently updated our T's and C's, terms and conditions for procurement of new services, to also include certain things that we're going to collect, like default SOC 2 reports, right? And these vendors, software as a service vendors, and we also stipulate you can't give us Microsoft or Amazon's SOC 2 report. We want your SOC 2 report, right? And so we're tackling vendor management on a multiple tier front, from an asset perspective, a process perspective, using technology to better manage, and also create an operational rhythm, if you will, on how we're going to inquire and reach out and validate that the vendors are doing what they're supposed to be doing along those lines. We're eventually going to get to the point where we're going to be requesting of some vendors the ability to audit them on occasion as well, too, depending on the impact to the organization. So hopefully that kind of answered your question. Yes, sir.
What did you find to be the best type of tool to use when you guys went work from home, when everything kind of went to the cloud and you were managing multiple web apps behind the cloud? What did you find the best tool to use for, like, from a detection and response standpoint?
So can you clarify, when you say detection and response, are you talking about like of cloud assets and the traditional security tools and things of that sort?
Correct.
So that's kind of a multi-tiered question. So I'll try to do it without, again, shilling for any company. Just because we use CrowdStrike doesn't mean I'm advocating. That's just who we use, so just heads up. So it depends on the nature of the cloud service is kind of the short answer to that. And so obviously I mentioned the web application firewall. We had to go with a hosted solution for that to expose our internal applications, so that's one aspect. Another aspect of that is we're primarily an Azure shop, but we are, again, because we want to be a cloud broker, apparently when we grow up, we are going to want to put controls and tools in place to be able to manage and gain a single visibility along those lines. That one's still being planned for, if you will. But I've already had those conversations from a strategic roadmap perspective that we're going to look at tools to give us that insight. And then some of the other tools that we have along those lines, so the work from home, we did implement CASB SASE technology, I won't mention the vendor by name, to deploy. That did require an agent on the endpoints because we saw obviously an increase in laptops and a bunch of devices, remote. So we're able to slowly, and it's still a work in progress, but we're getting our arms around those devices as it relates to remote security, DLP functionality, that sort of thing. So in case of DLP, we have a 3-tiered approach to security. So we have that at the firewall level, understanding that not everything traverses the firewall. We have that on the endpoint for those devices that skedaddle. And then we also have a strategy for cloud-based services. So that's how we're tackling that one. And then lastly, our Azure environment, for example, we have virtualized firewalls, we have virtualized servers, workstations in there. And so in those instances, our existing portfolio of endpoint solutions and protections are still applicable. So we've just migrated those to the cloud as well. So again, not shilling for them, but we're a Palo shop. So we've set up virtual Palos up in Azure. We're using those endpoints for the virtual servers and workstations and things of that sort. So hopefully that answered your question.
Hey, how you doing?
Hey.
So in relation to the hack that happened with Uber recently, that was more just a fatigue issue on the admin, right? Where you continuously spamming someone for the authentication. But when you do like a gap analysis, how will you determine that flaw? I know it's just one of the things that just came up recently, but it seemed like something that could have been a conversation. I guess what I'm saying, like, you spam someone long enough and they finally hit approve and they happen to be an admin, and next thing you know, someone goes rampant in your environment. But when you do a gap analysis on your quarterly or however often you do it, how would you see something to, foresee that? I guess what I'm asking.
Yeah, man, if I had an answer to that, but
is there any way that you can
Look, cybersecurity, fundamentally, from my perspective, is an odds game, right? You're just playing the numbers. If I don't know about the other CISOs in the room, but the first thing I do whenever I work for an org is I try to level set with executive management, saying if you're expecting 100% protection or no failure rate, then you're just setting yourself up for loss. And I'm also trying to maintain my job. But that aside, so to your specific question, so the way we try to skin that cat in Maricopa County is we just try to bring in different perspectives and bring in a certain level of discipline on those assessments, right? So what we do in Maricopa County, and this also helps with governance, by the way, so because we are decentralized, we have a program strategy. It gets updated a minimum twice a year, more often depending on what goes on. And in that strategy, we also do a self-assessment at a high level. So I don't want to give you the impression that it's real stringent or it's like following the NIST, the NIST standards to the T. But we do a self-assessment of what our security posture and maturity is for our respective areas: security operations, assurance, engineering, architecture, and governance. And so we talk about what we believe is good, what are gaps, and where those risks are. And then that helps inform our strategic roadmap of why we're doing what we're doing, right? And then on top of that, we'll bring in third parties to either do broad assessments or specialized assessments. So let's say, for example, again, this shouldn't be any surprise to anybody in the room. We've gotten a little bit of news about the whole election thing at Maricopa County. So we brought in a third party to come in and do a tabletop exercise for purposes of being prepared for incident threat, or insider threat, I mean. So the possibility of either intentional or unintentional threat against the organization to compromise the operations of our elections department. And so we'll do that, and then we share the results with the appropriate organization. We've brought in a third party to do a purple team against my operations team, for example, and we share the results of that with the rest of the county. And then this year, we're going to bring in a third party to do a formal maturity assessment against our entire program. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so fortunately, yeah, so the gentleman's like, sounds like a budget. Yes, we do have a budget, and so we're lucky along those lines. But the first part of that answer is still applicable. Take a look at your program holistically. Focus on what the core mission and objective of your organization is. In my mind, that should help inform where your focus should be from a cybersecurity perspective, right? If you're an e-commerce shop, then your focus should probably be on things like what your relationship is with cloud vendors. PCI should obviously a big one, and make sure that you're compliant along those lines. And that should help inform where your priorities are. And then if you're a 100% cloud shop, my guess is you should probably be more focused on API security, right? Because that's how you're consuming those services, as opposed to on-prem, vulnerability scanning, whatever the case is. So have that guide you, and that doesn't cost a nickel. So are we out of time, or? Okay. Any other questions? I think Pat set up this table because this is the second person from this table. So anyways.
So you talked about doing self-assessments.
Yeah.
I'm assuming you've already done yours. What were the challenges? What were the top one or two that emerged as these are the biggest gaps that we've got to address?
You're really going to put me on the spot, man. I'll do it without giving specifics. How about that? So, because we're in the security business, man. I can't tell you, it's like asking for our router configurations. Nobody would ever do that, right?
Let me
Anyway.
You know what? Rather than put you on the spot like that,
No,
for your team, for the InfoSec team, whether it's learning,
Yeah.
or adopting to new technologies. Don't have to get too specific. Something general would be nice for those of us who are about to embark down that path.
Well, I'll try to answer both, to be fair to you. So, in Maricopa County, some of the bigger challenges: 100% IT asset management, a huge problem. Also, in a lot of instances, the consistent and enterprise approach to network segmentation, to be honest with you all. So that's something that we're tackling along those lines. I'm pleased to say that we have a roadmap and we are executing against that already. I will say probably the newer threat against the organization, honestly, not to turn this into my other typical keynote, is kind of the merging of kinetic and cyber risk. And so a lot of that's been caused by the use of social media and mis and disinformation campaigns. And so my premise for my other default keynote that you can attend at some other time is any organization that is concerned about brand reputation or trust should be concerned about how you're being portrayed in social media. But what we've also seen as a result, because we're Maricopa County, so that doesn't help. But what we're seeing is social media is not only a barometer for increased cyber risk, but it's also it's actually a better indicator of kinetic or physical risk. So not to get too long-winded, but I will tell you, as a result of the 2020 and 2022 election cycles, we've seen social media used as a clearinghouse for intelligence used against us. So my ops team, for example, managed to get on a QAnon research forum and found a 30-page dossier put together about our recorders. We've seen social media used for logistical purposes to try to coordinate caravans to follow county staff between polling locations or things of that sort. Now, we're not suggesting that we are not in support of peaceful protests. Obviously, the Constitution allows that. But from a security perspective, obviously, we have to be concerned when we know that there's going to be a large gathering of folks, within any sort of proximity to personnel and or, facilities. So that's new. But from a team perspective, I will say one of our two biggest challenges is the lack of governance before I started at Maricopa County. And so we've addressed that to a large degree, so that's good. And then the other thing is my ops team was great. They're very good at reactive, but we had no game when it came to proactive services. So namely in the form of your earlier questions, sir, so doing either technical risk assessments, pen tests or whatever, or doing risk assessments, I'd much rather get better at preventing problems before they became problems as opposed to continuing to invest in my ops team only and being really good at reacting when stuff does hit the fan. So, yeah. Do we have time or no?
If we make it quick. If we weren't streaming, I would give you more time, but our
Nope.
stream's about to end, so.
No problem.
So, like the voting stuff, right? So right now, I think they're using ballots. Is there any reason why we're using ballots instead of, blockchain technology?
Wait, is there any reason why we're using ballots?
Instead of blockchain technology,
Oh.
or just
So
technology
go
in
talk
general?
to the vendor ecosystem on that one, man. So, and again, Maricopa County was accused of electronic voting, which we don't do. We use ballots. So just a reminder to everybody in the room. So, but yeah, unfortunately, we can't dictate, the vendor ecosystem in terms of that option and those sort of things. So once that becomes more mature, which will be after I retire, by the way, maybe that'll be something we contemplate. But hard for me to say on that one. So thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it, and I hope the lunch was good.
Okay, thank you so much, Lester.